Good morning, bird nerds. It's the bird emergency. Today we're going to talk to a bird loving author and podcaster with an interesting story about getting into birds. Good afternoon, Courtney B. Ellis. How are you?
I am well, Grant. Thank you for having me.
And I neglected to introduce myself. I'm Grant. I'm a bird nerd podcaster, and the only authoring that I've been doing is writing SEO optimized descriptions for a web page or a YouTube description. So, Courtney, I'm in awe of anyone who can be disciplined enough to write books. Now, how many have you written now?
This bird one that just came out in April, this was number 5, but it's the only one that features birds. So for your audience and for our chat, this is the one we want to talk about.
But just before we jump straight into The Thing with Feathers, which is the latest book, and also Courtney's podcast, which we'll talk about more in depth. But how does somebody leap into becoming an author, and how do you stick at it? Because in my understanding, very few authors actually get a reasonable return from their work. So what is it that drives you to write? How did you start like the idea that you're going to write your first book? I mean, everyone's got one book in them apparently, but not everybody writes it and goes through the process. And I know a bit about it. I used to work as a book editor and in a publishing company. So I know what's involved in putting a book together. How did you take that first step into book number 1 and then get right through to book number 5?
I've been writing since I could hold a pencil. It's just always been part of my life. I was that kid who always had a journal going or always was writing a short story. It's just always been part of my life. And in college, I asked a favorite professor, should I be a writer? I think I want to be a writer. And he said, Courtney, don't be a writer. There's no money in it. Go do something else that you feel called to do that'll pay the bills. And if you're supposed to be a writer, the writing will happen anyway. You won't be able to stop the writing. And I've really found that to be true. I write in the margins. I write on my lunch break. I write when I'm waiting in line to pick up the kids from school. It's just been part of my life. So the publishing journey actually took me about 10 years between writing my first book and getting my first book published. And those 2 books were not the same book. So that's often part of an author's story as well, as you write things and you think they're great, but you haven't really grown enough in the craft. You haven't progressed enough as an author to have things that are worth publishing yet. So I have 2 books at home that sit in a drawer that will probably never be published, but I've grown as a writer in the meantime. And I write because I love it. I write because I love books. I love words. I love connecting with authors and readers and things like that. So I can't turn it off. It's just part of me.
I've spoken to a number of authors and generally connected with birds, obviously, but there seems to me to be 2 different types of authors. And I wonder if you can put yourself in either of these baskets, or if there's another one that I'm missing. There is the author that loves using and crafting words and sentences and uses that love to tell a story. But then there's those who have the story is what drives them, and they use the words and sentences to best portray the story. Does either one of those describe you?
I love that question. I don't know that I fit neatly into either one of those. I love them both so much. Yeah, in addition to growing up with a pencil in my hand, I grew up in libraries and I grew up in bookstores and I grew up with books around me all the time. So I do love the craft. I love the idea of choosing the exact right word for the sentence. I think it was Mark Twain who says the difference between the almost right word and the right word is the difference between the lightning bug and the lightning. And I think that's really true. Like you can just profoundly change the meaning with one tweak, with one phrase. But often when I start a book, I have an idea in mind. I have a direction in mind. And the key is to getting all the words to stick to it in the right places.
So that process of finding the right word and the exact right structure, I think often, I mean, it's the difference between being a writer and a journalist, I think.
Yeah.
And but that's not to say that there are not journalists who are not writers, but they're generally writing long form copy. They're writing feature stories, um, or the best opinion writers, I think, are writers at heart. But you mentioned you had a love of bookshops and libraries. Now, I'm, I had a love of bookshops growing up, but I'm out of love with bookshops now, and that's
How come?
because most bookshops now are rubbish,
Yeah.
right? And I often wonder, um, are there that many great books out there now just because of the way that the book industry, the retail book industry, has developed? I mean, I remember when Borders came to Australia, and I thought they were the greatest thing. You could go and sit down, get a coffee. You could find books about everything. I mean, Borders stores were better than your local library. But of course, over time, Borders has gone, and every bookshop, unless it's a specialist bookshop, maybe your town is lucky enough to have a real book lover who runs it. All bookshops now are just franchises, and frankly,
Mhm.
they're shit. They are shit. And I have to go to my local library if I find out about a good book, and I have to ask them to buy it because the book won't be in the bookshop. I mean, uh, I have one bookshop in my local um, mall that has virtually no bird or gardening books, which is what I want. And the ones that it does have are often discounted stuff from the US or the UK, which in the bird sense have almost no relevance to Australia.
Right. It doesn't
And
help you.
no, and I mean, it's the same. I know it's Barnes and Nobles, isn't it? Which is really
Mhm.
what Borders was. That kind of same store here. Are they still great bookstores?
They can be. I'm a big fan of the used bookstore. I love a well-curated used bookstore. That is my happy place. We took a little family road trip last summer and tried to hit every single one we could on our trip, and the kids just fell in love, you know? It's a treasure hunt, and I love that because bookstores really are often about pushing the biggest thing and the newest thing, and often those aren't the best books. Like you said, you've got to find those treasures and those hidden gems. And so I'm a big fan of the used book market. That is my jam.
Yeah, I should probably extend a little bit how the bookstores are here. There's these big ones, and there's a couple of chains, and they focus on, as you say, the the latest and greatest. That's generally in biographies and and autobiographies and things like that. Then there's like celebrity cookbooks and all that kind of rubbish, and then there's sort of facto stuff like the history of the world's railways and travel books and stuff like that. Those stores do that stuff really well. And then we've got the remaindered bookstore. You know, those we get pop-up bookstores everywhere, and it's just selling all the junk that the publishers couldn't sell, and they've sold them for like 50 cents a book or something. And because they weren't successful in their first run, they're not really successful in their second run. But I think of them as bookstores where, oh my God, I forgot my friend Jenny's 8-year-old daughter's party is coming up. I'll grab a book.
Yeah.
And then you get something really crappy. Uh, Used bookstores in Australia are basically gone
Hmm.
because you can't we don't have the big enough populations in the towns to make them viable. So I always find secondhand books being put out in the rubbish, the hard rubbish collection, and which is such a travesty. And I always think of all those bird books from the 1950s and 60s and 70s and 80s that are just like, will probably be lost unless you go to your state library. I assume you have big state libraries where every book is sort of collected and held onto.
I don't actually know. I know we have a national library, but I don't know if we have state libraries as well. It's a good question. I'm gonna look it up when we get off.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know we have quite, even though we're very similar in a lot of ways, our countries, I think, we have municipal libraries and things which are reasonably well funded, but really well loved by the communities, and we don't seem to have tension about diverting public funds to libraries. I think, and so many schools don't have good libraries, so schools use the municipal libraries as a major resource. But I gather many libraries are under threat in the US, and I wonder if that reduces the lifelong love of books for people.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a possibility. The things I loved about libraries as a kid were I was just allowed to just go in and explore. And when I ran out of things in the children's section, I'd go to the teen section. And when I ran out of things in the teen section, I'd go to the adult section. And I think once we start banning and being afraid of ideas and not letting the free expression of ideas run its course, we're in a little bit of hot water. So, but our local library is phenomenal. It's the place. Our oldest son is in 6th grade, and after school he walks to the local library so he can hang out there. And we're very blessed to have a really good one in town. So the opportunity to see some of my books at our library was one of the highlights of this book coming out. It really, it's sales numbers are one thing and reviews are one thing, but to have it at my own local library, that was a great moment.
Do you get your relatives to order it all over the country?
No, yeah, we do try to do that. Yeah, we do. And this particular book is a birding story, but it's also the story of the death of my grandfather. So it's a deep family story as well.
Well, we'll leap into that in just a second. I would really like to know what your progression of subjects in your books has been. And how do you select them? Because I'm assuming that being creative and being a writer, you've got pads or exercise books full of ideas. Does the publisher help you find those, find the ones to develop, or do you take a fully formed idea to a publisher?
Yeah, I have a wonderful agent I work with, and usually how it works is I have an idea and I'll write up a proposal and then I'll send it to my agent and she'll thumbs up, thumbs down, or it needs a little bit of work, because she knows the industry much better than I do. And so I've been blessed to work with, she's my second agent, but both agents I've worked with have been amazing that way. But in terms of the ideas and the process, I usually write what I need to read. I've looked for this particular resource. It's not out there. Okay, I need to create it. I need to discover it for myself. So the books, I'm a recent birder. I've only been birding hardcore for about 4 years. So there aren't many birds in my previous books, but I wrote about what I needed. I wrote about the spiritual practice of simplicity. And then I wrote a book about spiritual practices for parents. I was a new parent and I knew I needed some spiritual practices in my life. And every book I picked up said things like, start your morning with an hour of quiet prayer. I'm like, my baby wakes up at 4:45 in the morning. Like it's impossible. All the books were written by men or by monks or by people who lived a very different life. So that was the second book. Third book was about happiness and play, and how our brains are kind of wired to be very playful. And the more serious we get, the more unhealthy we can get. And the fourth one was about the the idea of staying put in one particular community and learning to love that community rather than always looking for the grass being greener and being transient. As my husband and I had moved 9 times in 10 years of marriage, and we decided we were done. We were putting down some roots. We were committing to a place. And then number 5 is the birds.
Do you mind if I ask you why you moved so often?
Yeah, we were both in graduate school, and we ended up in different graduate programs. So that took us from Chicago to New Jersey to Nashville, Tennessee. So many of the moves were schooling related, and then after that, they were vocational. They were job related.
Now, I always get confused about how the American tertiary education system works. So
Yeah.
when you say it was education related, was that because you were moving schools, either one of you, to pursue certain subjects or particular courses, or is it a function of having to find postgrad work to support your or your graduate studies? Like, is it clearly either of those?
Yes, it's usually you apply to programs all over the country. For some people, we applied all over the country, and you see where you get in, and then you move for the school, and then you find work where you're schooling. Yeah.
Okay, so it wasn't that you are getting a stipend or something as a postgrad when you're moving, because
No,
I
so
know that's a big driver.
Yeah, all of my graduate degrees are master's level, and then my husband finally went on and did a PhD, and at that level, he got a stipend, and that was a good day. We got that letter. That was a good day.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, education is at the tertiary level is super expensive there, and we have a deferred payment system here, but when you are postgrad, you just have to fund it on your own, and that's very, 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 very difficult. So, how do you stay grounded when you're moving around so much? Did birds and nature help you stay grounded and connected to place when you move around so much? And the point of the question really is, do you start to recognize the familiar trees and animals and birds around you, or are you looking for familiarity when you're moving so often?
Yeah, I grew up in love with nature. I grew up in the North Woods of Wisconsin, lakes and trees. But then I have a real section in my life where I was so focused on schooling, and I was often working 2 or 3 jobs to be able to pay for that schooling, where there really is a poverty of nature. For about 10 years of my life, I just didn't do much. I didn't go out much. I was at work, or I was in school, or I was studying. And it makes the rediscovery of the beauty and the messages and the power of nature at this phase of my life that much sweeter. I grieve for those years where I could have been learning all the birds of New Jersey, but I had no time and I wasn't paying attention. I could have been learning all the birds of Tennessee, but I had no time and I was not paying attention. And so I'm in a season really of recovery. I've missed all of this. How can I make birding a deep part of my daily practice here and now, even when life gets really full, because it fills a person up like nothing else. It's a game changer.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was a bird nut as a kid, and then when things got busy and I did some things for work and for lifestyle that sort of totally turned the back on birding. It was a totally different lifestyle, but I've never been able to not notice nature, the plants and birds. I mean, I'm just identifying birds and plants no matter where I am, what I'm doing. They're always out the corner of my eye, and just drive people mad. But I did learn very early that you don't really talk about birds with your friends because they
Yeah.
go, God, shut up.
Here he goes again.
Yeah. Now, now I really wanted to have you explain the reawakening of the love and appreciation,
Hmm.
and 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 the importance, the sort of internal importance of oh,
My
what's
lights
that?
are turning off. We're okay.
That was weird. Of birds, and introduce the death of your grandfather. Can you talk about uh, whether what influenced that reawakening the most? Like, what was the initial part of that?
Yeah, early 2020. I don't know if you remember this, but there was this pandemic. We had this pandemic.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
we're not. I don't think we're allowed to say the C word anymore.
Don't say it. And we all found ourselves stuck inside for a bit. And so I started looking out the window. I'm trying to do my job remotely. I'm trying to school my kids remotely. Everything is chaos. The world is ending. This virus is coming for us. And I would look out in the backyard and the birds were fine. The birds were doing their thing. And I had a friend over about a week before everything shut down, and she pointed to my backyard and she said, "You have a Phoebe." And I said, "I have a what?" And she said, "You have a black Phoebe out your window. Go look." And sure enough, I didn't know what it was. I had never paid attention to it before, but that little black Phoebe has been in our yard every day for the past 4 years. And I thought, if I haven't noticed a bird in my very own backyard, 3 feet outside my window, what else haven't I been noticing? And it opened up this whole world. I would go for a walk every day for my mental health. I couldn't be shut in the house with 3 kids and a computer all day every day. So I'd go for a walk, and I walked up into the hills around our home in Southern California, and I discovered just the beginning of all that I didn't know. The fact that there were finches and warblers and ibises and birds I didn't even know existed out here. And it just blew my mind. I can't walk outside now without hearing birdsong, identifying birdsong. But that was the start of the journey into birding for me. And then about 2 years into that journey, my grandfather, who had always been part of the nature heritage of my family, he was a fisherman. He liked animals more than he liked people. He was an introvert, borderline hermit who was always happiest when he was ice fishing or when he was out in nature. He became very, very ill, and I traveled back to see him. And I didn't know it at the time, but that trip ended up being the trip where I said goodbye to him. I was at his bedside until about an hour before he died, when I had to leave and catch a flight. So weaving together the discovery of birds, the love of birds, with this grief story, became the book Looking Up. And when I talk to birders, it's interesting because many people get into birding for the first time in a season of grief. It's grief that takes them outside. It's grief that makes them look out the window. And so for so many people, the story of birding and the story of healing from grief, of processing grief, are really tied together.
I sometimes hear people with stories of their pets helping them through a period of grief, and
Yeah.
they love their dogs and they love their cats. But I find a really different intensity and a really different um, angle from the people who have, through some sort of traumatic experience, reconnect with nature and birds particularly. So, do you have do you find a very different emotional connection with birds than you do to wildlife in general?
I do. I think, everyone has a spark in their life, and we talk about having a spark bird. For some people, it's baking or it's hockey or, fill in the blank. And birds have become that special spark for me. And I think what was surprising to me was so much of parenting and adult life is you have to drive yourself toward these goals. You have to get up, you should exercise, you've got to pack the kids' lunches, like all of these things that you have to do. And birding came into my life as this just pure joy. It was not something that asked anything of me, that required anything of me. It was happening whether or not I went out and observed it. And it felt like such a gift. It felt like such a grace. And one of the things I loved about birding in a season of real sadness and difficulty and grief was that the birds are so gentle. They're not in your face. You can sit quietly for an hour and just see what you see. And in that hour, your soul kind of starts to settle. Your emotions kind of start to find their places. It's its own kind of therapy, really. It was transformative for me, and I'm so grateful for it.
I'm going to challenge you a little bit on that notion of birds being gentle, because I now have a pet bird, and I had pet birds when I was a kid. Like, I had an aviary, and then I never wanted to have one again. I never wanted to have cage birds, but a bird, a lorikeet, so a little colourful parrot, flew into our window on New Year's Eve while I was live streaming, and my housemate got the lorikeet. Anyway, he's asleep out there, asleep in his cage now. But being at close range with this creature, especially when he's wet and had a bath, and he looks like a velociraptor with a beak and colourful feathers, and seeing so many birds interact with each other, they ain't gentle things. They are vicious and cruel in their own community. So
Yeah.
how do you find the gentleness, or what do you see as gentleness in birds that, when I'm observing them, I see the absolute commitment to competition and survival, and I don't see a lot of gentleness unless they're doing something like allopreening. But nestlings throw each other out of the nest. I mean,
Yeah, for
they'll,
sure.
they'll peck their siblings to death to get one little bit of morsel of food more. So, explain to me where you see the gentleness in the birds that you're observing.
No, nature is red in tooth and claw, right? Just that famous phrase, for sure. I tell the story in the book of a Cooper's hawk coming into our backyard and just exploding a mockingbird. I mean, there were feathers everywhere, and it's eating dinner and we're eating dinner, and my kids are like, "Ah." No, I don't mean that nature itself is gentle. I think there are gentle aspects of nature.
No,
I mean,
I got that. You reference birds particularly, and that's
yes.
where I really want to go down that path.
Yes. No, it's not that the birds are gentle. It's that it felt like what they required of me, what they asked of me was very gentle. That they're just there doing their thing. And in stark contrast to so many other things in my life, my job, my kids, my marriage, all these things that I kind of have to manage and keep going, the birds were just there. And that felt like a balm to my soul, that I could walk outside and interact with them however I needed to, and let them do their birdie thing, and just be gifted with the chance to watch what they were doing and to enjoy what they were doing. I just a couple of weeks ago saw my very first lifer loggerhead shrike, and those are crazy birds. They're beautiful songbirds that just rip other birds apart. They've got these hooked beaks and their talons, and they're so strong. But at the moment I saw it, it was just hanging out. It was just, the gift of walking down this trail and seeing this bird I've been seeking for 3.5 years. I've made all these special trips, never seen one. And I rounded the corner on that day, and there it was. I love that part of birding, the whimsy of birding, the unexpectedness of birding. I drove miles and miles and miles and miles to find this bird, never could find it. When I least expected it, there it was.
Oh, well, I think that that's clarified for me whether you're a lister or not, because you're out there in pursuit of lifers. I might just add, because this is our different positions on the birds, that shrike was probably looking contented and everything because he just ripped a house finch to bits
Right.
and was digesting his dinner.
You had a belly full of lizard or something, for sure.
That's right, exactly. Um, do the shrikes in the US, because I'm not sure if they're true shrikes like the European shrikes, do they hang their prey up in bushes,
Yep.
creating a
Barbed wire
larder?
fences. Yeah,
Yeah,
yep. You
yeah,
find half a lizard and you know there's a shrike somewhere. Yeah.
yeah. The larder for later. Yeah, yeah. We don't have true shrikes here. It's funny because songbirds actually originated in Australia, New Guinea, New Zealand. In the
Hmm.
Gondwana, and all the offshoot families are called true from the old world. It's just a bit backwards. Can I don't know how you would like to have the discussion about the death of your grandfather, and how you know birds fit into that. You said that he was sort of your put a word in your mouth, sort of your wildlife mentor, your nature guide, from childhood. How how did you how did you deal with those emotions of loss? And I didn't know from your story. I must admit, I missed it, that you had to leave. You had to leave before his final passing, and that seems to me to be really, really, um, well, sad. I mean, it must have been extremely difficult to spend those important um, hours with him and days with him, but then have to be taken away. So, are you able to talk about how you felt about having to leave, and then how do you reconcile the loss of somebody when you, I don't know how to say this really um, really well, I guess. I would feel like I had been robbed of that important time, and that he had been robbed of that important time too. How how do you deal with that and just keep going?
I think it helps to understand who my grandfather was. He was very quiet. He was very reserved. He could do about 30 minutes of good social time, and then we would find him out in the truck. He's like, "I'm ready to go. I'm waiting for your grandma. She'll be another 2 hours, but I'm gonna wait out here." I think it's likely it was some form of social anxiety, but he was the generation that doesn't diagnose those sorts of things. And so at his dying bedside were everybody close to him who had loved him. It was me, it was my parents, it was my sisters, it was my cousins, it was my aunt and my uncle. And, by the time I had to go to the airport, I had had the chance to say everything I needed to say, and he was unresponsive. And I've worked for hospice in the past. I've been a hospice chaplain for a bit, and people really do kind of have a say in when they go at the end. And sometimes people who are really reserved, really introverted, will wait until their spouse goes out of the room to the vending machine, and that's when they die. And my sense with my grandfather was he was going to choose his time, and it might be when not everyone was there. And so I had made my peace with that. I had the chance to speak to him. He was briefly responsive. He squeezed my hand. I felt like we had a connection. And then it was time for me to go. It was a surprising gift to be able to be with him nearly right up until the end. I thought I was going to see him, to see how he was feeling, and it turned into a trip to to really say goodbye. So once I had wrapped my mind around that, I wanted to leave that spot right next to him at his bedside for my grandmother, for his wife of 64 years, and they fought like cats and dogs. They were just at each other all the time, but to give that final moment to the two of them, I think was the right thing. I think he knew.
When you mentioned your grandfather leaving a social occasion, family get-togethers, I mean, it reminded me of one of my favourite uncles who must have had a very similar constitution to your grandfather, I reckon. He couldn't tolerate the mindless chit chat that would go on at family gatherings where you haven't seen someone for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and you've got to pretend to be interested. I mean, you weren't interested in them last week. Why would you be interested in them today? And he used to go out to his car, and in summer, his excuse was, "I'm just going to go and check the cricket scores, and in winter, I'm just going to get a score in the footy." And he'd be there for like 20 minutes. Hello, drink the obligatory glass of beer or wine with everyone, and then he'd gradually get to the back of the gathering, and then he'd be gone.
Yeah.
And he'd just wait until Auntie Judy had had enough of it.
Yes.
Of everyone and ready to go home, and he'd just be sitting in the car waiting,
not
angry, not upset,
not complaining. No, just he was done. Yeah.
I can't put up with 5-year-olds, or Now, and funnily enough, he was two of my uncles were like my bird and nature spirit guides. They were really heavily invested in conservation efforts and, being involved in lobbying for planning and whatnot, as well as lending me their bird books and things like that when I was a really little kid. Do you still feel acutely the loss, perhaps the absence of your grandfather? That's probably a better word.
Yeah, I do. It was just a few days ago was his 92nd birthday. So, I wrote to my grandmother and contacted her. She's all the way back in Wisconsin, and my parents took her on a nature outing so she could have that memory. I think, grief is funny because it's not like you ever get over the loss of someone, but you learn to carry it differently. And I think in his death, the ways that my family reconnected and found each other and were able to tell stories and laugh. And, I learned more about him in his death, which was a great gift. I learned things about his time in the military, and I learned things about his childhood that I didn't know. So I will carry that loss forever. But I think as time goes on, it's carried a little differently. But I was surprised at the weight of the grief. We live 3,000 miles away. We would see him at best once a year. It's a big, expensive trip to get home. And it still felt very different knowing that he was gone, even though I wasn't seeing him every day or anything like that.
Your parents took your grandmother on a nature walk.
They did. They took her to a state park. Yeah.
Okay. Now, with I'm interested in connection to nature with the whole family. Are all of your siblings and your cousins sort of connected to nature since you've had, similar familial influences, or do you stick out amongst your siblings and your cousins?
My father describes himself as indoorsy. He grew up in Chicago. He likes his air conditioning. And I wonder myself if I would have gotten as into birding if I didn't start in Southern California. We have beautiful weather. We have very few biting insects. It's very pleasant to bird in Southern California. My friends who bird in Florida and Georgia and Texas have these stories of coming home covered in bug spray and chiggers. And I'm like, I don't know that, I think it's been a very gentle gateway for me. me. But I grew up with a family. We were outside a lot. We lived on a lake, but it was very it was gentle outside. It was you play outside for a couple hours and then you sleep in the house. We tried camping a few times. It didn't really stick. We would do some hiking, but we were kind of nature light. You know, my parents weren't really into like the field guides or things like that. They took us to a lot of national parks. We went to Yellowstone. We saw Yosemite. We got out, but it wasn't their first love, I would say.
Were they into the road trip element of it?
Yes.
Like,
They
okay,
liked
so
adventure. You know, we
yeah,
would do
okay,
Yellowstone, but then the next year we would do Gettysburg, so we could talk about Civil War history. They liked excursions in general. We would do Disneyland in the next year. You know, it was something to do.
yeah. I had a girlfriend once that I went on several road trips with, and she was into nature slash the view,
Yes.
whereas I was kneeling down, going, "Oh my God, look at this Drosera!" Now that's
Right.
a sundew, you know, and I go, "Oh wow, look, there's orchids here," you know,
Yeah.
and she'd be going, "Come on, come on, there's another lookout point down the road. Let's go
Yes.
there."
Yeah.
Anyway, that's an aside. Now, are you traveling now, like yourself? Do you mentioned the Shrike, but do you regularly go on a dash to go and find a new bird?
I used to. I used to be really driven by adding to the life list, and it's shifted probably over the last year to more of a slow birding practice, more of a where is an interesting spot and what am I going to see when I'm there? And it's less frantic and a little bit more soulful. I think I was often when I started birding, I was trying to fill out my list, but I was also trying to bird and exercise at the same time. I'm a working parent. My free time is limited, you know, so I'm gonna go really fast and see what I see. And I realized I'm enjoying neither. I'm not birding in a way that fills me up, and I'm not actually getting the exercise I need because I keep stopping. So I've had to really separate the two. But when I see a new bird and can add it to my list, I'm thrilled, but I don't chase anymore.
As a birder, I really want to pull that apart a little bit. How did you begin listing, like this process of sort of rediscovering the birds around you? How what made you want to list? Like, did you feel that that's what birders did, or was it to assist you to identify new birds?
The ID piece was a big part of it. But I like writing down what I've seen and where I've seen it because it puts me back in that birding day. You know, I hold so much in my mind on a given day with the writing and the kids and my job that those details can fade. But if I have a list, okay, this was the day I was at the San Joaquin Marsh and I saw a vermilion flycatcher, and then I saw, you know, I enjoy going back to it that way. And I use the Merlin Bird ID app, as so many people do, and it keeps a list for you. So that's kind of a fun thing too, a fun element of it. Gives you a little confetti, saw a lifer. So I don't list every day, but I do tend to track when I've seen a new bird or a bird doing something unusual for the first time.
I'm really interested in how you use your physical list, your pen and paper, or your exercise book, or however you're keeping your lists when you write them down, and using Merlin. Like, are you consistent with both? I can't do it.
No, I usually, once I get back to the car, I'll put things in Merlin because the other thing I noticed, Merlin is such a great tool, especially if you're first learning to ID birds and things like that. But I didn't want to be on my phone all the time when I was birding. I wanted to be birding. So I usually try to keep my phone in my back pocket and see what I see. And I keep a little paper list because that feels more restful to me. That feels less, you know, if my phone is out, I'm also getting notifications and I'm getting emails, and suddenly, you know, my brain is full of things besides the birds.
Yeah, crap, like
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
people. Yeah,
Right. I forgot to pick the kid up at basketball practice. Oh no, now my birding is ruined.
Mom, where are you?
Oops.
I'll be, I'll be there after the Shrikes finish ripping the house.
Right. I'm 4 miles into the woods. It's going to be a while. So sorry.
Oh, got off track there. So, when did you start listing? So you said you're relatively newly acquainted with birds. I think you've grown up with that appreciation of them, but in a different a different level of intensity. So, did you immediately begin listing once you were working out what the birds were, or were you more fully immersed in the joy of birds again before you started writing down your well, actually, let me ask another way. Was it thoughts and feelings first? Were you? It seems to me that there's that attachment that drew you. Birds help draw you back into your sense of place. So, what were you writing? Were you writing about the birds you saw, or were you writing about the feelings that you had when you saw the birds?
I write everything. My life is littered with notebooks and things. I'm not sure which one came first. I mean, the immediate thing was the feeling like, this is interesting. I want to pursue this. I want to look into this. Yeah, I think that was first, but soon thereafter, I write about everything. I write a little column for a place called Fathom Mag, and I have a monthly column, so I think the birds showed up very early in that monthly column. We had a bunch of mourning doves that would sit on the stone fence right outside our window where we'd sit with the kids and eat breakfast, and the observation of the kids and the mourning doves. And that was the first thing I remember writing about birds. And I think the list started soon thereafter. And probably the list started just in the Merlin app before I started putting that on paper. It's a really handy little tool.
Yeah. Well, your kids sound like they're in perfect bird indoctrination age group now.
That is my plan.
So, well, how do you, like, if you're looking at your kids, from afar, like if you step back and you're watching your kids and their personality and what they are seeing around them, can you see if they're connected at this age to birds?
Yeah, they are, and they each are in a different way. We have an 11-year-old, an 8-year-old boy, and then a 5-year-old girl. And our oldest is into superlatives, so he wants the fastest and the strongest, and so his favorite right now is the peregrine falcon, because
I was just going to say, that's peregrine falcon,
and he'll notice them. I ordered a book on peregrine falcons a couple of days ago, and he's like, "Can I I'm gonna borrow?" And I was like, "Yes, take it, please." Our middle kid is always really fascinated in how things work, so he's interested in the mechanics of things, and often that's engineering, and he's always taking stuff apart in the house. And where's the screwdriver? Oh, Wilson's got the screwdriver again. He's got all the tools in his room, but he's interested in the mechanics of flight, and he's interested
in the difference between a stork and a swan and a duck.
Yes, and why does one have this sort of beak and one have this sort of beak? He loves that. And then our youngest, our only daughter, is in love with crows right now. Her favorite color is black. We have crows in the yard every day. And at first I had to, yes, at first I had to stop myself, like, oh, it's only a crow. And I was like, no, crows are amazing. Crows are fascinating. So she names them and she talks to them, and they hang out at her school and they hang out at our house. So I do things, we buy birding books, and I leave magazines open places to kind of foster that. But also we're letting them find their own birding way.
Well, that sounds like you've got 3 very definite personality types there.
Yeah.
How about binoculars? Are they fighting over binoculars, or have you managed to get them each a pair? Or?
They are. We usually they don't like to carry them. So they're usually around my neck. And when they see something cool, then we'll hand them off. And we've learned that kids' binoculars are terrible. Like you really do need a pair that costs a couple $100. So that I carry them, they don't get dropped and they use them. The other thing they really like to do is they like to take pictures of them. So my daughter has a little like Instamatic camera, or they'll take my camera, my iPhone, and that's been a good gateway for them as well. They like the mechanics of that.
Well, that's great because you preempted my question, because I was going to ask you about photography and birding, both for you and for the kids, because I think that's a very different way that people can enter the the life of birds, and also collect the memories. But also, they're such a great way to identify birds rather than
Yeah.
write down field notes,
Yeah.
which
And
we
to
all know.
remember. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and we all know that writing down field notes is extremely tedious, but it's a great way of disciplining yourself to look for those field identifying features. All right, we talked a little bit about the genesis of the book, but why a podcast? I there, there's such very different mediums, and the creative and production process is so different. Um, why did you start the podcast?
I started the podcast in January of 2023. So I think we're on episode 80, somewhere around there right now. And I started it because I wanted to be able to talk to more people about birds. And my husband, God bless him, is not a birder. He's birder adjacent. He's conversant. He puts up with it. He'll go on walks with me. But, we would go on a date and he'd say, honey, like 3 bird facts. And then I will listen and I love you. And then we're moving on. And, I respect it. I'm not into all the things he's into, but I was really excited to talk to other folks about birds. And if you start a podcast, it's amazing the folks who will say yes to talking to you. So I've gotten to talk to Ken Kaufman and Amy Tan and Margaret Wrinkle and some of my favorite, Frank Izagari, some of my favorite birders in the world. I've gotten to meet really interesting people united through our love of birds. And to spend an hour with someone whose books I've respected, or whose field guides I've read, or whose birding practice I've followed, and ask them anything is so much fun. And the other reason I started the podcast was there are a lot of science-y bird podcasts, and there are a lot of faith-based podcasts, but I'm a pastor, I'm a Christian minister. And so to be able to talk about faith and hope and birds was my goal. And some of my guests, we just do science. They say, birds are my church. I don't want to talk about faith. And that's fine. And we have great conversations. But some of them are people of science who say, I'm never able to talk about my faith. And, I'm Mormon, or I'm Jewish, or, this is how my faith influences my birding practice and my spiritual life. And so marrying those two things together has been really, really fun. And kind of the third reason was the faith I'm a part of, the Christian faith, often has a terrible reputation when it comes to the environment. They are not the first people in line when it comes to caring for creation. And I like to work against that stereotype. I like to raise up Christians who are doing good, faithful conservation work, ecological work, caring for creation, and to help educate folks in my faith community that science is real and the earth needs our help.
I'm glad you drew that connection, because that's something that I'm often struck with. I mean, with someone who is not invested in any faith, but I will say I think I can still call myself potentially agnostic.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. I'm
Yeah.
always amazed at the people who will publicly profess their intense commitment to a religious faith, and it's not necessarily one or the other, but at the same time be part of the cheer squad for the destruction of the environment, and particularly when, if anyone wants to talk about end days, I think there's lots of things that we can look around and might give us a few hints about changing behaviour, and I always find that's a curious way for people to separate. They're able to separate their faith from their personal spirituality and totally ignore society and the whole sense of ecology and ecosystem.
Yeah.
Do you have an internal dialogue about that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think my particular faith of Christianity has gotten twisted to say, well, eventually Jesus is going to come back and all of this is going to burn anyway, so it doesn't matter, which is such a corruption of, I think, what our sacred texts teach, which is that life begins in a garden and people continually choose wrong over right. And God tells us that we're stewards of this garden, that we are to care for creation, not destroy it, not abuse it, not mistreat it. And there are a lot of streams of Christianity that believe in that. There are a lot of Christian organizations out there now trying to care for creation in much more tangible ways. But yeah, it's a constant source of frustration, either that twisting of scripture or folks who say, well, earth doesn't matter. Heaven is what matters. What we're living right now doesn't matter. Eternity matters. But they both matter. And God has given us this beautiful world full of these beautiful creatures. How dare we treat them as poorly as we have? So yeah, I got a whole bunch of sermons on that, but I won't do that to you. But I think what the beautiful thing is in this podcast is I'm able to bring some of these communities together to say we may not agree politically, we may not agree in terms of religion, but we're rowing in the same direction in terms of saying we love birds, we want them to be taken care of, and we're going to need to work together. It's going to take all of us to do this well.
Yeah, I didn't want to get too philosophical, but there's a rule in the history of humanity, and every greatest country and every greatest society in the world has fallen.
Yeah.
So it makes it sort of a little bit strange to hear people who profess faith and spirituality and that they can't appreciate what we're doing to swallows and martins and siskins and phoebes. I just shake my head. It's my favourite emoji.
I'm with you, Grant.
So I really want to explore how an author decided to start the podcast. Like, isn't that... It takes a lot of energy to do both well, I think. So, and I'm just impressed because you got young kids, you're still maintaining a relationship with your husband. How do you do it? I'm kind of blown away.
Yeah, writing is my first love, but I think I love writing because I love storytelling, and podcasting is just another version of that. It's drawing out people's stories. I've had very big name guests on the podcast, world famous guests, but I've also had people who, are running a raptor rehabilitation clinic in their yard and no one knows them, but they have a story. And so it's that passion that drives it. I don't watch a lot of TV and I don't like to sit around. And so the free time that I do have, I love to be able to help people tell stories or to tell my own stories, whether it's in writing or podcasting. And I think, one of the ways I want to help make the world a better place is by putting more beauty and hope out there. So we always end the thing with feathers. I ask my guests, where are you finding hope these days? And sometimes they'll talk about a great birding project where they're seeing, a bird who is near extinction come back because of conservation efforts. But other times they'll talk about, I'm seeing hope in the classroom. I'm working with children and their hope gives me hope. So that's the question that unites the end of the show. And yeah, it's that love that drives me. Although I will say it used to be a weekly show and now it's every other week because I couldn't sustain that pace of editing and that rhythm. I mean, it takes a lot to put a show together. So every other week has proved to be a good rhythm where now I look forward to it rather than trying to squeeze it in.
Yeah, I've had to take some breaks from it because, I was finding it hard to once the pandemic and the work disruptions for so many academics were over, and they had years of work of research that they had to catch up on. I was finding it hard to land the people I wanted to speak to, and
right,
because they're catching up. The world did stand still for almost 2 years. That's and we're still trying to catch up on that now. What's the most satisfying thing that you personally have gained or garnered, maybe is a better word, from both podcasting? Let's start with podcasting, and then I'd like you to tell me what you, whether it's different, what you get personally, and I think more as a feels thing. I'm not talking about the huge fortune that you've amassed from publishing.
I made $11 from my podcast last year. I just want to put that out there. 11 whole dollars.
Well, that's $11 more than I've ever made from my podcast.
It paid for almost 1 month of the service I used to produce the podcast. So this is good.
Yeah. No. Let's start with that. I mean, what does the podcast give you, I guess, that writing doesn't?
It gives me wonderful live connection with other birders across the world, across the country, who come from different perspectives and different backgrounds. Being able to learn from them. I miss being in school. I loved graduate school, and to be able to sit with, I had Julie Zickafoos on the podcast a few months ago, and she's this prolific author who's lived on the same homestead in Ohio for 30 years. And the things that she's seen and learned in caring for this land, it just blew me away. I walked taller the rest of the day having learned from her. So it's that gift of folks who have expertise in a particular area and are so excited to share it and to talk about it. It feels like a gift beyond measure. I don't make any money from the podcast, but the fact that people come and talk to me for free, that's amazing, and share their story with our listeners. It's such a gift.
I started podcasting when I had to explain to people what a podcast was, and that doing a show on YouTube was not a podcast. A podcast was actually an audio file. It was uploaded and it was only distributed through RSS feeds, and people had to really know about podcasts to get into it. And now there's people who do a YouTube show and go, it's a podcast.
Yeah.
No, but I'm very grateful that it is a lot easier now to reach more people by being on YouTube and Facebook in a way that you couldn't before. If you were given a choice tomorrow, and it was Courtney, actually, I'll put on my omnipresent, omnipotent being voice. Courtney, you may only write or podcast. What do you do?
I think the writing can't be turned off. I'm fairly new to podcasting, but the writing has gone on forever. At someday I'll be in an old age care home and I'll still be writing things, and it's just part of me. So,
You'll be in your old age care home writing, and every other Wednesday you'll be sitting around a table with Joyce and Gary and Phil and Sonia talking about the week,
yes,
rapping about the week and putting it
for
out on
sure.
YouTube.
For sure. Yeah. We'll be able to just podcast with our minds, 50 years in the future. So it's good. Won't need any equipment or anything.
All right. Well, let's just do the ad. The Thing with Feathers podcast. Courtney B. Ellis. You will find it. You will find it most easily if you want to go to the website where you can see all the things that Courtney does. CourtneyBEllis.com. Okay, that's the best place to go. But if you want to buy the book right now, you can go to Amazon, and if you search Looking Up Ellis, that's where I found it easily. Looking Up Ellis, A Birder's Guide to Hope Through Grief. You can find that. And, oh, look, so many. You've got a 4.7 average rating. That's pretty cool.
People like it. Yeah. It's been very well received. I'm very grateful for that.
That's right. People are saying it's a great book. So, yeah. All right. Let's do sort of the rapid fire before we wrap up.
Deal.
Favorite place to go birding?
San Joaquin Marsh in Irvine. It's got riparian areas, it's got ponds, it's got woods. You can see 40 species there if you're walking around for an hour without even trying. It's a wonder.
Bucket list birding location?
Costa Rica.
Ooh. Now, is your bucket list bird in Costa Rica?
My son, my oldest, in addition to loving peregrine falcons, is in love with toucans. He did a big school project last year on toucans, so I feel like at some point he and I have to go see a toucan together.
I follow someone who trains birds on Instagram, not on Instagram, on YouTube, and they have macaws and toucans, and when they are interacting with them, I'm struck that how similar toucans are to parrots. I think they're basically parrots with big stonky noses.
Yeah.
They are almost. I mean, you could almost lay over parrot behaviour that I've experienced with toucan behaviour. So I hope you get to Costa Rica. So what is your bucket list bird? Not your son's bucket list bird.
My current bucket list bird is another one of those nemesis birds that my friends keep seeing all over Orange County where I live, and I have yet to see one. It's called a swinhoe's white-eye. It's a small little warbler. It only lives in Orange County. It's from China, actually. We don't know how they got here. But they're beautiful and they're tiny, and I have been looking for one for 3 years.
Actually, let's look that up, because I'm guessing, because we have white eyes here, and as you say, they're a sort of East Asian family. I'm just going to look this up because I'm thinking that they might be escapees or releases from historical caged population. So I'll just pop.
Interesting. Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. But they've been taunting me for years.
I'm just going to pop this up just so people can see on. I mean, we have white eyes here that we call silver eyes. We've got a couple of species in Australia, and they're big right around the world. Let's see. Range map. Oh yeah, there we go. Not showing really much there. So how did they cross the Pacific? I'm not seeing them on
That's
Pacific Islands.
that's the
Uh,
question, isn't it? My friend Mark lives in my same town and takes dozens of pictures of them in his backyard, and if I go over, they're gone. One of these
yeah,
days.
I'm not seeing that eBird hasn't really made made any kind of call on that. So yeah, that's pretty amazing. So that's your bucket list bird. Um, that's crazy. They are they're they're really little.
Yeah.
When they're around, you'll hear them though, because they generally travel in small groups or medium flocks. If their behaviour is similar, they follow the weather here. Um, yeah, and we have a population that moved down to Tasmania in the summer
Hmm.
and then come up through my area, Melbourne in Victoria, and up the, the sort of southeast coast. So they pass through twice a year, but they're only in my neck of the woods for maybe a week. Um,
Hmm.
but you can't miss them because they're noisy. They're,
Yeah. Yeah.
obviously, folks, before you ring in or write in and say you aren't seeing Swinhoe's white eye, no, I'm seeing silver eye, and I'm only seeing one particular race of silver eye. I know that, but yeah, white eyes are cool. Now you mentioned that you um, are using the camera, but and that you are using Merlin. But do you have a field guide, or do you have several field guides? And if so, which is your field guide of choice?
Oh, it really depends, it depends if I'm gonna carry it out there, then I want a really slim one, but the one that I love the most at home is we have a National Geographic Guide to Birds, and it's the entire birds of North America. It's big, it's black, it's hardbound, and the kids and I will just sit and flip through that for hours. You get lost in the weird duck section, and then you get lost in the warblers section, and the illustrations are really beautiful. And so that's a favorite. I've taken that on more than one road trip, even though it's got to weigh like 8 pounds.
Yeah, we had the Reader's Digest book of Australian birds when I was a kid, and it was like that big and
Yeah.
that wide and really chunky. Uh, and I took that camping, and when I got caught in a, a camping on a river flat,
Yeah.
um, which you're not supposed to do. I think I was about 9 when this happened, and the river came up overnight, and it was about this deep. The water around destroyed the book. So that was
You only
that
do
was
that
a
once.
yeah, and I had that bird book, which was great for photographs, but I had my 2-volume Field Guide to Australian Birds by Peter Slater, and it destroyed them too. So I learnt that lesson. Don't take your bird books out when you're going camping. Well, now you don't need to, because you've got everything you could possibly need
Yeah.
is in that. Um, I got distracted with that. What's your most necessary piece of equipment that you take birding?
Sun hat, because here in
Sun
Southern
hat.
California, I've got blue eyes. I get so red so fast. So yeah, that sun hat, I just keep it in the car now. Sun hat and binoculars hang out in the car, so they're always ready to go.
Okay. Well, I think. Oh, what's the best bird?
Yeah, so I have one tattoo, and it is a song sparrow sitting on a cedar branch. I love song sparrows. They're really common around here. They're in all 50 states. They're smallish, they're brownish, they're drabbish, but no matter what the weather is, they keep singing, and I find a lot of inspiration in that.
Well, those people who have been with the bird emergency since the very beginning know that the whole reason that the bird emergency exists is because of sparrows. So,
Hmm.
I wouldn't say I'm a lover of sparrows, because we've only got introduced sparrows here. But sparrows are an important gauge about how we're going in terms of preserving birds. So let's get your thought on that. Being part of the adult voting population in the greatest country that's ever existed, as I keep hearing in the recently, and because apparently no other countries care about each other and have democracies and do good stuff, and healthcare.
Arrogance is a singular American virtue, isn't it?
Yeah. How do you think, because you're sort of detached from the rough and tumble. Often I'll interview people who are involved in terms of being an activist.
Yeah.
But how do you think you're doing and let's talk about California and the country generally. How do you think you're doing in terms of bird conservation and biodiversity conservation, or preservation? That's probably a better word nowadays. Preservation of biodiversity generally.
Yeah, there's a lot of hope, a lot of places. I would say there are a lot of hopeful things going on, and we also have a long way to go. So one of the things we talk about on the show, we talk a lot about conservation on my podcast, and I bring in a lot of guests who are doing work in conservation, things like bird-friendly beef that I had never heard of before, preserving the grasslands and things like that. And we encourage everyone to start where they are. So I wrote a letter to a city council member back near where I grew up in Wisconsin this week, because they're talking about mining in the willow flowage, this really delicate ecosystem of wetlands. And it's like, I don't live there anymore, but this place needs to be protected. So having chances to do even small civic conservation work is always a joy. So good things are happening, but we can do much more.
Have you received an acknowledgement?
Not yet.
No. I hope you do. Do your members or representatives have to acknowledge correspondence?
I don't know at the city level if they do. And especially if it's a constituent who isn't one of their constituents anymore. But there was a petition going on, and I was happy to sign on as part of it.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. I think at our state and federal level, they have to acknowledge correspondence legislatively. So they don't have to do anything. They just have to say, thank you.
Got it. It's in the incinerator. But it's those little things, and the opportunity to tell these stories on a podcast, but also to raise our kids with an awareness of, they're the ones who notice if the soda can went in the trash, and they fish it out. And they're like, Mom, it's recyclable. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. I was distracted. To the next generation is bringing with it a lot of hope. They've all got their reusable water bottles. They're starting young with those small choices that have a big impact.
Going off topic just slightly, but I always do this. You raised that. Now I wonder whether, and you'll have to tell me whether the situation is the same in the US as it is here. We have a really good recycling program here, where people sort their rubbish, and I've been doing it for years. And we used to collect newspapers when I was in the Scouts, and we'd have them all collect and everything, but nothing got recycled. And we're only working out that this is a problem now that China and Thailand will no longer take our crap. So, and the reason I bring this up, I wonder if it's the same in the US, that like 80 to 90% of all of the materials that we diligently sort and put out for collection either gets exported to another country that dumps it in landfill, or burns it, or we dump it in landfill. Now we just fill up warehouses. You're not allowed to dump it. So now we've just got all these warehouses all around the country that get filled with pallets of this stuff, and then they catch on fire and poison everyone in the neighbourhood.
Yeah.
So the point of asking is, we've been so diligent in putting energy and awareness especially for the kids, into doing what people think is good. But essentially it's meaningless because it doesn't get recycled. So we've been distracted for 20 or 30 years instead of reduce, because we have reduce, reuse, recycle. All of the emphasis has not been on reduce, and that's been a corporate scam.
For
But
sure.
we've all willingly gone along with it.
Right, because if you reduce, you're not buying anymore, and that's not good for capitalism.
Well, you could be.
We're not buying as much, right? That's yeah.
But we could be really recycling and reusing that resource. You know, aluminium, all metals, glass.
Yeah.
We could be doing that. We could, and we could still be buying stuff and eating stuff. I don't think that would stop. So the point of asking is the situation the same in the US? And do you think that because when you wake up and you realise that, holy moly, this has been a scam, that people turn away from doing the right thing, a positive thing, because it didn't do any good anyway?
I think there's a great risk of that happening. And our recycling program in America has been very similar to what you described in Australia. We're shipping things to China. They don't want them. We bring them back. You know, the idea that this, you know, I'm here, I've got my plastic water bottle that I'm drinking out of that is going to live 1,000 years is really troubling. But yeah.
4 years.
Yes.
And it shows it.
But that temptation, then I did the right thing, but it did no good. I'm giving up. I'm throwing up my hands. That is a great risk. And I think as a culture, as a country, we need to look into what are the things that actually would be helpful, would be useful. I live in California, which is a really progressive state, and they've started some new composting programs and green waste programs. And so we're able to do things with food and eggshells that are fairly new just within the last 2 years, which is great. But also, I don't think my recyclables are all getting recycled, even though I'm faithfully putting them in the right bins. So what else can we do? And like you said, so much of it is about reducing and reusing, because I'm not my kids anymore. I'm not growing out of my sneakers every 6 months. I can wear my sneakers for 3-4 years, and I should, rather than offloading them because they're not trendy anymore. And I think that is a big shift that needs to happen.
2012.
I love it. I love it.
I think, I mean, I do wear my credentials on this. My life fits into, apart from furnishings that you like, a table, a desk, which we got from the hard rubbish, by the way, and the computer screens. My life fits into a suitcase and a backpack.
Yeah.
And every 6 months, I go through everything I've got, and if it hasn't been used in 6 months, it goes. And I don't buy a new item of clothing without putting something in the bag for the recycling, and you have to be careful about where you recycle your clothes, because we have this. Because so many things are a scam, and they're designed to make you feel good, but they're not. Anyway, I didn't want to be downbeat on that. But the point of asking the question is, if your kids, I mean, you've got one coming into teenage years, do you think and the relevance is, do you think actions for conservation and biodiversity preservation will become more radical because that works, when all the feel good, you know, don't rock the boat kind of stuff that we've been doing, which is a lot of communication and awareness, and obviously our recycling and sorting our rubbish and stuff. Do you think the teenagers of today are going to say, stuff that, we're not doing this now, we're occupying, we're blockading, we are, you know, and even more radical, because when your grandfather, he was part of the greatest generation, right?
Yeah.
When they felt under threat, they went and killed people.
Hmm.
And that's just simply, we did it. Uh, geez, in the First World War, when we weren't the least bit under threat, but we thought the colonial motherland was under threat, we went the other side of the world and killed people. I wonder whether when people recognise that we are losing everything that we rely on to live, whether the niceties might be put aside and some really radical action might follow. And I'm conflicted by
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
I'm really conflicted by this because I think, like most people, we say violence is never the action, never the answer, and everything.
I think every
But
generation,
maybe it
yeah,
is.
every generation has its choices to make. And fear is a great motivator, hate is a great motivator. And I think what we've seen, even in lower levels of conservation projects, is the greatest, most powerful motivator for people is joy. And when folks soak in despair or act out of fear or act out of rage, you can make progress, but often that progress is built on a foundation that's really shaky. When you get people to fall in love with nature, suddenly they're motivated to do more good. So that is my hope, and I see a lot of that joy and that hope in this generation that we can make a difference. And that joy is a fuel that fear never is. um
You know,
that's my hope.
you know what? I'm just thinking about that because I wonder if that's true. What what social movement that has had any consequence has resulted from joy? The civil rights movement came out of assassinations and riots. There's no joy in that. It's only been repackaged 40 years later as being something of joy. Women's suffragettes movements were protests and violence. There was no joy in what happened in Britain and Australia in the women's suffragettes movement. And they're two things that were really consequential. I'm trying to think of anything. I can't think of any. No wars been won. No, no despots or dictators have been stopped by joy. Can you think of one?
Well, I think of Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent resistance, and it was brutal for them, but the end goal, the end motivation was freedom
Yeah,
and
yeah,
equality, right? So that internal engine is not, we want these people to suffer like we have suffered. The end goal is we want to all stand on equal footing as humans, as
yeah,
people.
yeah. But
So
that,
I
but
think
that's
how
a,
it
but
plays
that's a
out
different
is
thing.
different. Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
right. That's
no,
a
I see
different
I
thing.
see your point.
The goals come from those places of love or peace or shared humanity, but the mechanism of achieving it comes from. They've all rooted in violence. Either the violence that has been put on them. I mean, even people talk about Gandhi. I mean, nothing happened. There were no changes in getting rid of colonialism in India that didn't have a basis in the upheaval of violence. I mean, the Second World War is what led to the partition of India when England was no longer a great colonial power, and then when it started to happen, there were religious massacres that I guess what I'm saying. Do you think? Because it's about conservation. I feel that we're right at the precipice of maybe not our own survival, but of thousands and thousands of species. And there's going to be people who don't care. There's going to be millions and millions of people who don't care. But I think there's going to be millions and millions of people who do.
Mm.
And that, this is why I'm conflicted. I feel like in an Australian context, we voted in a government that was going to do all this great stuff for conservation, and they've done nothing. And now we look like they won't even get a second term. So we'll go back to the other mob, who are the business as usual, dig it up, send it off overseas mob. Where do people who have been protesting in the streets and carrying placards, where do you go when that doesn't work? Where do you go next?
It's a good question.
Yeah. All right, last question I want to ask you. Have you interviewed the avian Rebbe?
I have, yeah.
Good. Oh,
Eric Eisenstein.
Yeah,
good dude. Good conversationalist.
Yeah. No, when I saw your posts and the podcast, I immediately thought that we might have a similar conversation. As it turns out, I've been far more radical than I was with him. So Courtney, what's next with the what's next in books and what's next in podcasts?
What's next in books? I signed a contract a couple months back to work on a book called Weathering Change, and it's about how animals cope with times of transition and how we can learn from them to better weather change in our own lives. And I'm working on a section right now in that book about my kids going back to school and how everyone has very big feelings for a couple weeks because transitions are hard. And I'm also working on a passage about the Skeleton Coast in Namibia, where I've never been, but it's this fascinating ecosystem. And I'm doing a lot of research around the Skeleton Coast right now. Next in the podcast, a new episode just went out yesterday with Quentin Schultz, who's a retired professor of communication and a Michigan birder. And we had a great conversation. He grew up in a really difficult, alcoholic, abusive family situation, and birds and nature were one of the things that kind of saved him. So it was a good talk.
And you mentioned Namibia. I'll tell you how far we've come in a number of years. Can't even remember. This was in the 80s. I was interviewed by the Victoria Police because I had worked with a guy who was a singer in a popular band to put on a fundraiser for the Southwest Africa People's Organisation, SWAPO. Now, Southwest Africa is the colonial name of Namibia. So it was to support a freedom movement here, and that was extremely subversive in that the police were basically sussing out whether holding a concert at a university and doing interviews about it made you a terrorist. It's weird to think. So yeah, Namibia. That's on my bucket list.
Yeah.
That mammal migration that part annually in Namibia and Botswana. Love to go to Botswana as well. Would be amazing. Well, Courtney, thank you for such a wide-ranging and interesting discussion. I wish you well with the new book and continuing to kick goals with the podcast and hopefully turning more people onto the love and joy of birds, and more particularly bird watching. And I hope your kids in the coming years each find in their stocking a cool pair of binoculars.
Thank you for having me, Grant.
It's been a pleasure. So when's your next episode of The Thing with Feathers?
2 weeks from yesterday. So they come out every other Monday, because Monday is a day we all need a little bit more hope.
Well, Monday's the day everyone puts their podcast out, I think, isn't it?
No, actually, most come out on Tuesdays. So I was trying to get a leg up on it.
Oh, must have changed.
Yeah.
I try to put my things out on Monday, and they usually come out on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
There you go. Whatever works.
Well, that's right. Whenever you get around to it, Courtney, have a great afternoon. I hope you find your next lifer in your backyard. And shorebirds? Are you out on shorebirds yet?
Yeah, I need to work on my shorebird ID. They still all kind of blend together for me, but I'll get there.
Yeah, that's right. Well, they're a challenge, but
Yeah.
that's the fun of birding. It never gets old because there's always a new group of brown birds that are hard to identify that you can go and get acquainted with. So
For
please,
sure.
everyone, go and look up Courtney's podcast, particularly The Thing with Feathers, and you can find the book Looking Up on Amazon. Just Courtney B. Ellis, Looking Up. Just search any of those terms and you'll find all of Courtney's books. This has been The Bird Emergency. I'm Grant. I'm a bird nerd. Let's get it right. That there is Courtney B. Ellis, author, podcaster, and birder mum. Good on you. Thanks, Courtney.
Thanks for having me.